Please.
So thanks very much. It's good to be back in Kiev again. The subject of my talk, and I apologise because it's probably the light, but the title of the presentation concerning North Korea is The Other Side of the Hill, Misunderestimating the DPRK. Now, the other side of the hill is generally a phrase associated with what is happening with the enemy, which is essentially how North Korea is being perceived. But the second aspect is misunderestimating, which, for everyone's benefit, is actually not really an English word. It actually originated with George W. Bush, who had a tendency to sort of mix his words. And essentially, the misunderestimating is a combination of two words. One is misunderstanding, in other words, not quite understanding what the situation is on the other side. And the other side of it is underestimating, which is you perhaps don't appreciate the full capabilities or the actions of the other side, both of which I think singly apply to North Korea, and particularly perceptions of the country. I was over in North Korea for about 3 weeks in July. I'd done my doctorate in North Korea, looking at the institutions and the various systems that govern the country. But I had never actually been. In the 3 weeks I was essentially based in the capital, which is Pyongyang. I had the ability to go to other towns around North Korea and have a pretty good look around. So I went to some of the major cities, including Wonsan and Hamhung, which is on the east of the Korean peninsula, Nampo, another city on the west, and then also a trip down to Daesong, which was the ancient capital of Korea, but also roughly where the demilitarized zone is, which is the border area that splits North Korea and South Korea. I'm hoping this will work. Perfect. But it's funny, I actually had been earlier on in the year to South Korea and have actually visited the demilitarized zone from the southern side. And I actually went to something called the Third Infiltration Tunnel. Essentially, you go in at the ground level and you go down about 10 minutes. It must be at least 1 kilometre on a very, very steep incline. And this was essentially a tunnel that was built to connect with the discovery of a North Korean tunnel that had been built underground. Now, this underground tunnel that the North Koreans had built had actually been quite an excellent piece of engineering. They were able to basically shift essentially 2 ranks of soldiers through this tunnel, and the calculation was they could get 30,000 troops from the north into the south if there was ever a conflict. Now, the interesting thing was, this is the 3rd tunnel. There have been 4 found. But in fact, everyone believes, back on the basis of defectors' reports, that there are at least another 20 tunnels that are essentially being built by the North Koreans under the demilitarized zone. No one has got any idea where these tunnels actually are. The only reason why they found this tunnel was because they'd actually, I believe, tried to dig down for some water, and suddenly they hit the air pocket and this thing erupted like a weapon. But despite the fact that they know that there are these tunnels, they have no actual idea where they are. But it impressed me a bit about the sort of the engineering and also the rationale, which is why I call the North Koreans essentially the tunnel kings. And it's worth bearing in mind, going both backwards and also looking at the contemporary side of North Korea, what the implications of that has meant. The Korean War that took place between 1950 and 1953 is a war that I think has generally essentially been forgotten by history. If you go to the United States, to any bookshop, you will see bookshelves on the Vietnam War, but you'll see very few books on the Korean War. And I think there's a very good reason for that, which is the Americans would prefer not to be reminded of that particular war, where, let's face it, well before the Vietnam War that took place in the 60s and 70s, they were essentially fought to a standstill by a very small Asian country. That war was of an order of intensity that, again, has little been noticed. 3 million citizens died on the Korean Peninsula. Now, that may appear to be just a sort of a very large figure and statistic, but if you bear in mind that 2.3 million Japanese died during the whole of the Second World War in Japan, that gives an idea of how bitter the conflict was, the civil war that had taken place. The Americans suffered something of the order of about 38,000 dead in a period of just 3 years. Now, the next highest figure of casualties was 55,000 in Vietnam, but the Vietnam War took place over about 11 to 12 years. The Korean War, took place over 3 years. It was a hugely intense conflict. The Americans essentially had got what they call air supremacy. So in other words, its bombers could pretty well fly anywhere over the Korean Peninsula, and they bombed it very heavily. Most of the cities in North Korea, and a fair few even in the south, because some of the south was occupied by North Koreans when the war started, were essentially about 70 to 80% destroyed. And by the end of the first sort of 6 months of the war, the Americans were essentially had run out of military targets and had really resorted to machine gunning peasants in the fields. That's what led to the Koreans essentially going underground and tunnelling to get themselves some sort of protection from the US bombers. But there's also another aspect about North Korea which is probably very little understood, which is that essentially North Korea is got extensive mineral reserves. The experts generally believe that there are essentially something between the order of $4 to $6 trillion worth of resources under the ground in North Korea. Now, to just again put that in context, the GDP of North Korea is not much more than 26 billion. So essentially, they have got a huge mineral resources available which they're able to sell onto the world market. What have they got? Iron ore and other ferrous metals, gold, silver, lead, zinc, magnesite, limestone, kaolin, anthracite, lignite, and also coal. They've also got, subject to control by the Korean People's Army, uranium mines as well. And they have amongst the largest graphite and magnesite resources in the world. The Chinese essentially take most of the exports of mineral resources from North Korea. And in fact, from essentially about 2004-2005 onwards, because of what has been called the super commodity cycle, North Korea has essentially been able to drive about 80% of its exports or more to China, and most of that is essentially coal or other minerals. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind is that the Chinese have invested about $1 billion themselves in those raw mineral resources to develop. So for them, they have a stake in North Korea. And North Korea itself is essentially, as one economist put it in a very recent book, is essentially become a natural resources rentier. That's how it's making its money. That's how it's making the foreign currency earnings. Sorry, there we go. Building socialism. The construction, this is essentially Pyongyang. Again, not what you would normally expect, but essentially a gleaming city with a lot of skyscrapers, modern buildings. They'd actually also finished a new thoroughfare that went through the city. Just to anticipate the apartments thing, one of the interesting things was on this thoroughfare was that they built new apartment blocks for the professors of Kim Il-sung University. Each of the professors got a 260 square metre apartment, newly furnished. That gives an indication of perhaps where their priorities lie in North Korea. Construction accounts for about 14% of GDP. Now, that again may, on the face of it, appear quite a significant figure, but to put it in context, both China and Japan, other leading economies in the Asia, essentially also have relied very heavily on the construction industry. To just give one example, in China, the infrastructure, its ranking in infrastructure in the world was 60th position in 2006, but by 2016-17, China was 42nd in the world. That ranking went up because of heavy amounts of money spent on infrastructure. Similarly with North Korea. And the reason why I sort of say socialist construction is essentially the sort of the language of priorities is because essentially the economy is being driven internally by huge construction and infrastructure projects. Some of those are essentially being directed at the middle class to essentially cement their loyalty, hence the reason why I talk about the fact they've given these apartments to professors. But they're also essentially building apartments in other parts of North Korea, in a lot of the major cities. The other thing is that they also seem to be basically spending a lot of money on tourism. So, for example, again, when I was in Pyongyang, they had opened up a new military museum, which was based on around about 3 floors, very interactive, hugely quite impressive. And that had supplanted the old military museum. They'd essentially also built a new school performance theatre, so the kids can perform in front of all their parents and also visitors. That had replaced an existing school theatre, which so was significant. It was certainly several thousand people in the audience when I was there. They've also quite heavily spent on developing skiing places on the eastern side of the border, again to appeal to the middle class and to tourists. And part of all this sort of new socialist construction is to essentially meet some of the plans by the present leadership, which is to attract up to 1 million tourists a year. They certainly don't have that by any stretch of the imagination now. A lot of the tourists coming into Pyongyang are essentially from China, but clearly they are looking, I believe, as part of their plans to attract a significant number of tourists from the West. Let's see. But the tourism has the ability to generate quite significant earnings for them, and I think they're already earning reasonable amounts from Chinese tourists, because there was certainly a lot when I was there. The white heat of technology. There is no doubt that certainly when it comes to sort of both communist party and socialist parties, science is always viewed as an important part of their modernization propaganda or the modernization of the economy. Now, the white heat of technology, the expression actually comes from a Labour government in 1964 in the United Kingdom, which was essentially we want to create a newly innovative UK. This sort of concepts of trying to use science as a basis of ideology is not new. We can also look at, for example, Pakistan, where the Prime Minister in the early 70s, who went by the name of Bhutto, he was the father of Benazir Bhutto, who was later killed, basically said, look, even if we have to eat grass, we're going to have a nuclear bomb. Now, in one sense, that also has a sort of a UK echo, because again, when the Americans had cut the UK off from transfer of nuclear technology just after the Second World War, Britain's Foreign Secretary Ernie Bevan said, we're going to have a nuclear bomb and we're going to put a bloody Union Jack on it. So this sort of concept of technology going down the nuclear route is not unusual. And if we look to Pakistan and we look to Iran, given Korea's history, it was almost inevitable that they would go down that route, though perhaps the causes may not be that well understood by people. In fact, the reason why North Korea actually started to go down the nuclear route was essentially because of concerns over China. The border hadn't been settled with China. China had in fact invaded Vietnam in 1979 as part of a war. So the North Koreans, already given their anxieties, already given the fact that there'd been a Korean War, were essentially hedging their bets. My view is probably that hedging of bets has not been unrealistic given what probably happened, well, what has happened in Iraq, and the fact that George Bush, who was at the beginning called the North Korea part of the axis of evil, and essentially also what's happened in Libya, which had a nuclear project but gave it up under UK and US negotiations. The building that I'm just showing you here is something called the SciTech complex, which is, if you look at it, looks to be like an atom. This place, with the sort of electrons as the circles all around. I visited this place, and you know, again, another sort of typical socialist construction. They built this thing in about 8 to 9 months on an island, and got it all ready. It was all opened. On the sort of 3rd or 4th floor, there's obviously clearly hundreds of PCs. Not that many people there, but you know, this place is essentially the centre of the intranet for the whole of the country. So they've got all the factories, schools, universities, all essentially plugged onto this place. And again, it was indication of where again North Korea want to spend the money, which is on IT and this sort of computer expertise and knowledge. And interestingly enough, that then has sort of got me thinking about, you know, some of the stories that have appeared over the last 9 months. I don't know whether people are familiar with the word WannaCry. This was essentially a ransomware which effectively attacked, well, I think it was a worldwide attack, but it ended up pretty well almost closing down our National Health Service in the United Kingdom. The $1 billion brain is a reference by me to a quite extraordinary incident last year when people essentially tried to steal a $1 billion from the Bangladeshi central bank. This in fact got stopped very at the last moment, but not before about $91 million had been transferred to several casinos in the Philippines for men then to walk in with their suitcases and walk out, never to be seen again. The interesting story about this is that one of the former heads of British Signal Intelligence, what we call the government communications headquarters in Cheltenham, has basically estimated that the North Koreans are making about $1 billion an annum from this type of schemes. Ransomware, hacking, stealing information. Not a bad investment return on that building of technology and PC infrastructure expertise. While I was over in North Korea, I think I alluded to it at the beginning, I went to Hamhung, and Hamhung is of interest because it has a chemical works, which, interesting enough, we actually went and had a look around. The chemical works have an interesting history because they were built in the late 20s, early 30s by the Japanese colonist power. They were actually one of the most modern chemical complexes in the world. Of interest is that they were also where the Japanese had their nascent nuclear bomb project. So again, you see the various strands coming through of not only technology that had perhaps been provided by the Chinese on one side, the Soviets on another, but also their own local homegrown nuclear expertise that had come essentially from the Japanese colonial legacy. The going fissile I've already briefly alluded to earlier, but this final point, just to sort of ram home the message that people have misunderestimated North Korea, was the event that took place in Kuala Lumpur, I think earlier on this year, where Kim Jong-nam, who's the half-brother of the present leader, Kim Jong-un, was essentially assassinated in Kuala Lumpur. Now, The reason why I say binary message is there are essentially two messages that went out from that killing. One of which was, firstly to China, because Kim Jong-nam had actually been based in Macau, and there was essentially a warning to the Chinese not to mess with the family and to try and think about replacing Kim Jong-un. The Chinese have been engaged quite heavily in North Korea over its history, and there have been recurring purges by the Kim family of people who've been quite close to China, essentially on the premise that they know that the Chinese want to try and replace them at some point in time. So Kim Jong-nam, who'd been based in Macau, was widely believed to be trying to position himself as a Chinese replacement for his half-brother, and he was therefore essentially assassinated when he left Macau for Kuala Lumpur on business that has not yet been clarified. The other part of that message was the means of death. VX, which was the chemical that he essentially had, was essentially made of two materials. Both of them apart are essentially no threat to humans, but once they're put together, they essentially kill. Now, that use of that particular instrument of assassination was a very clear warning to other people, just in case they haven't got it, that North Koreans have a very strong chemical warfare capability. And in fact, the Hamhung Chemical Works is part of that particular process. So that was the binary message. Misunderestimating the DPRK. I think there are several things that need to be borne in mind, because often there is a sort of a direct link taken between North Korea and South Korea. South Korea has essentially got about a $34,000 per capita GDP, whereas the North Koreans have got about 1,000. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that from about the 1950s all the way up until 1973, North Korea had essentially a superior economic performance to South Korea. Now, we often don't recall seeing that, but essentially North Korea was viewed as a considerable success story. It had run into difficulties in the early 70s because it had gone out and borrowed a lot of money from Western banks to essentially upgrade its industrial infrastructure. Got caught after the 1973 oil crisis with considerable debts, and then went into default. Because if we look at South Korea essentially was viewed by the Americans, particularly with their major aid givers, as a basket case. A black hole was some of what the intelligence reports referred to. And in fact, the United States essentially, on a continuous basis, bailed out the South Koreans despite massive corruption and other problems. And therefore you had constant IMF loans being put in place. South Korea's market sector, while it had considerable amount to do with the people's innovation and their hard work, some of which I might add are part of the Korean people's characteristic, it had more than a lot to do with the fact that the South Koreans were heavily involved in the Vietnam War, where they earned a lot of money on contracts, and where in fact 60,000 of their troops were generally based for about 10 years, being paid for by the Americans, and also on the oil boom of the 1970s, where in fact a lot of South Korean migrant workers were in the Gulf and the Middle East. Some figures put it up to about 1 million working during that decade, earning money. North Korea was not given an IMF bailout. It has basically kept itself to itself. And let's be quite clear, the Americans and a lot of the institutions, particularly the World Bank, the IMF, have not really wanted to do business with North Korea, come what may. In fact, North Korea is still closed to the international financial markets. That sort of leaves with the final couple of points on that. One of which is that North Korea, again, despite what people might think, has actually moved over the last few years to a market economy. There is a sort of tendency to believe that it is still a centrally controlled, centrally commanded economy, which is not the case, though it certainly is no doubt the case that the state, and particularly the government, have a very, very commanding control over what happens in the economy by virtue of being the largest consumer of certain services, the largest purchaser, and obviously, very clearly, the major employer. The migrants, I've sort of slightly alluded to, because there are often stories that, you know, about the North Koreans working in Siberia and also in China and also actually in the Middle East. But we shouldn't be that totally surprised by those stories, because that was essentially how South Korea made its way in the world. The sanctions illusion. The other harsh reality is that North Korea has been under sanctions essentially since 1948. Those sanctions have been increased certainly during the Bush years, and particularly even more so now under Donald Trump. But I think we should be very, very cautious about what the real impact of those sanctions will be. There is no doubt that the sanctions have not worked to the extent that certainly the Americans believe. And probably, if anything, they've actually reinforced North Korea's view about the way forward, which is to concentrate on a nuclear project. But certainly the evidence, from what I could see in terms of cars on the road, reasonable amount of goods in the shops, there's no doubt that where sanctions have not succeeded in bringing the regime to its knees, they certainly have constrained economic growth, which is another thing that I circled back to as being one of the real reasons why there is a difference between North Korea and South Korea. Final slide is the following. I think people have very much underestimated the stability of the regime. There are several things that I think people also need to bear in mind. One of which is that whereas in a lot of communist regimes throughout the world, you have essentially had the Communist Party as embodying a very, very small elite. General figures, I believe, for the Chinese Communist Party put party membership about a couple of % of the population. I believe was the same for the Soviet Union. I think they're also very much the case for a lot of the parties in the Central Eastern European region, with one exception, Romania. But the reality is the Korean Workers' Party, the governing party, has a membership of at least 16 to 17% of the adult population. And in fact, if you take into account the socialist youth movement, which they also have, you're looking at about 30% of the population is essentially wrapped up with the ruling party. Pyongyang is essentially, residence is driven essentially by membership of socialist youth or party membership. So I think, you know, we shouldn't sort of think that this is quite going to be the Soviet Union redux. I think there's a lot more support than people might think. The other thing is the Kim family, which, if we look over the sort of the history of the sort of, you know, communist rule, is quite an exception. I mean, I can only think possibly of the Castros in Cuba, Ceausescu's in Romania, and probably at a pinch the Milosevic's in Serbia, though the nature of that party was changing with the collapse of Yugoslavia, where there is a sort of like a family relationship that was being pursued within the actual ruling segment. But North Korea is somewhat different. The Kims have effectively been in power since 1945, and they've actually had two transfers of power. One from Kim Il-sung to his son, Kim Jong-il, and then again to Kim Il-jung. And those changes, despite a lot of wishful thinking, seem to have gone off without too much trouble. It's worth bearing in mind also historical continuities and also regional continuities. I think I gave a talk a couple of years ago where I alluded to how widespread family dynasties actually are, particularly in the Asia. And you only have to think about India, Japan, where certainly about 70 to 80% of all seats in Parliament are essentially inherited from the family, where in fact one family, which is where the present Prime Minister comes from, has essentially been in charge of the country for the better part of 20, 25 years, if I'm not mistaken. You only also have to look at South Korea. And therefore, the worrying thing that people might want to think about is that the Chosun dynasty, which ruled Korea essentially from 1392 to 1910 without any real interruption, was one of the longest lasting family dynasties in world history, as far as I can see. If I look at the UK and France, I can't think of any sort of dynasty, family dynasty, that has ruled for anything near that period of time. So I think people need to sort of consider the sort of family dynasties aspect of North Korea as part of, you know, a continuity of the past. The final point is, I think the economic and political change we should be very, very cautious about. Let me be quite clear, and without sort of, you know, because North Korea has got no civic society. The churches, which have always been quite important, if you think about in East Germany, particularly also in Hungary to a certain extent, but particularly Poland with the Roman Catholic Church, are all very much firmly under the thumb of the state. The other thing is that essentially trade unions, which again would be something that I would look at in terms of Poland with the Solidarity movement, again do not exist to any considerable extent. The government, while it may not meet the narrow definition of a totalitarian country in terms of meeting the control of the economy, has a level of sort of control over the population which I think is probably unparalleled in the world as far as I can see right now. The fact that the country has got a market economy basically does not mean that there's going to be a fast forward to a political change. And I think sort of talk about sort of being open to sort of social media and whatever, I think is somewhat overdone. So in other words, I for the moment don't see much evidence of major political change coming through to North Korea for quite some time. But I wonder whether people, particularly in the United States, have taken that on board. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Thank you. Are there any questions? No? Maybe just one for the road?
Chris, what do you think? A few days ago, a North Korean soldier was he escaped from his own country, and
to the South Korea.
South Korean soldiers take him. He was shot.
He was shot. I think he was shot a minimum of 3 or 4 times. I
6 times.
Was it 6 times?
6 times.
I knew he was shot in 3 different places because I saw the news report. I actually saw the film. I mean, he was an incredibly lucky guy. Yeah. Funny enough, I've actually been on that road, so in fact it was quite sort of because when I went to the DMZ from the northern side, I actually recall the buildings where he stopped his car from, and then got out and then did the runner. I think he was a very, very lucky guy. What I think was also quite interesting was I believe they removed a tape wound, didn't they, from his gut, which was about... Now, it's interesting because the famine took place in North Korea about 20 plus years ago. I think it's clear that there were certainly after effects from that famine that, you know, because I don't think you could have a tape wound that length from the last few years. I think it's clearly something that's probably been ingested in his system for quite some time. The issue, funny enough, that on food on North Korea, again, is something, again, people ought to consider. About 80% of the country is mountainous. The actual basket, food basket, was in the south. So when the division took place, North Korea were always struggling and they were always quite reliant on food supplies. They've actually done a lot of their food agriculture to try and offset the huge trade deficit they have with China. But I thought it was that sort of was quite interesting, that aspect, but he was a very, very lucky guy. I think there was also another soldier may have got over a couple of weeks ago. I think he also managed to get over, but perhaps without too much publicity. A number of people who've left, it's probably still not much more than about 30,000, 35,000. And a lot of those came over probably a good decade ago, which is an indicator for me that while it was quite something for him to get out, the issue is that conditions have improved. I mean, I believe the country was running food services for a couple of years, only until very recently. I'm not sure what will happen this year. The talk is that the harvests will be bad, so there may well be some issues in North Korea, and then we may well see more people. But my general point was being that probably not as many people have come over as perhaps was expected. And those that have had quite severe problems adjusting, I believe, in South Korea, because they're viewed as second-class citizens.
So do you agree with the thesis that people always escape from socialism, from communism? For example, famous writer Viktor Suvorov, he was ex-Soviet spy, now he's British, he lives in UK, yeah? He say about this, that people always escape communism.
The sad reality of the situation right now is that the North Koreans dropped communism from their constitution over 10 years ago. I mean, it's not a communist regime. I mean, it's a constitutional absolutist despotism, which probably has more in common with how Europe was run several hundred years ago rather than with a communist regime. I mean, again, they've dropped socialism, so you have what is essentially a sort of a home-baked, home-produced ideology called Juche, essentially, though it's really described within the constitution as Kim Il-sung and Kim Il-jung thought. I would say it's not really a communist society. I think it's a slightly extreme version of an absolutist monarchy that was used to operate in Europe a couple of hundred years ago, which again also speaks volumes for the ability for that country to change. Some of it, a lot of the ideologies, some of it's inherited from the Japanese emperor worship. Some of it is of extreme nationalistic, almost racist. I mean, it is actually illegal in the country for a North Korean to marry a foreigner, or in fact to engage in any form of relationship with a foreigner. So, there is some quite, I think to sort of say it's a communist regime is to perhaps oversimplify what is a slightly more complex and nuanced arrangement that's in place. I mean, there is obviously a certain amount given to the sort of Korean Workers' Party, but I would argue that the party itself is very much a vessel for the Kim family. And it's one of the modes through which they control the country. It's not the only one. They have Korean People's Army, which Kim is essentially both a marshal in and also the supreme commander. And you also have him as a head of state. So there are sort of multiple ways in which he controls the country. I put it, I think, in one thesis that it was actually a bit like the royal family in England. There are links with the armed forces, the head of the Church of England, and also essentially the head of Parliament. It's a sovereign parliament still in the UK.
So in this case, what are the perspectives of modernization of North Korea? Does democracy have any chance?
For the moment, I think democracy is not going to come to North Korea. I actually think we probably have a slightly more urgent task, which is how do we diffuse levels of tensions that are escalating on the peninsula, and to avoid what I think would be probably a catastrophe, frankly. I think that peninsula the last thing it needs is another war. I mean, just on that, the contrarian view is that actually a lot of the tensions are being created by Donald Trump with very little effect. The one thing I would say is if the situation really was quite as serious as everyone would think, you'd probably see Americans on the planes leaving Seoul. But everyone knows that that's not going to happen, because that would immediately mean that the North Koreans would probably strike. So in fact there is a conundrum. There's 24,000 American troops in Seoul, and families, and also people on businesses. So while I sort of looked at the sort of, the fact that there was no evidence of Americans leaving was a sure indicator, one, that the North Koreans know that Trump was bluffing, and the people who are essentially a front line or a tripwire are also essentially hostages of the North Koreans. The distance between the border and Seoul is negligible. I mean, with the tunnelling experience of the North Koreans, they have the ability to launch a quite significant artillery strike, which again is another card they have up their sleeve on Seoul, that certainly according to one estimate by a US general would probably lead to around 1 million casualties and $1 trillion worth of damage. So yes, there is tensions that are there. I think the biggest problem is probably everyone knows what's at stake, but whether the person in the White House does. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
I have a question.
Sorry.
So, we can observe the evident support of North Korea regime from China and Russia. Evident support. And maybe the problem is not in this political support. Maybe the problem is in the economic support of global economy for North Korea, because the global economy needs cheap goods, cheap labor from North Korea.
I think I would say that there's a measure of both. I think what's interesting is that North Korea has essentially adopted an economic model whereby essentially it wants to exploit its own mineral resources for itself, and also to engage in massive amount of construction, and also essentially keep people on the land to try and feed the nation. I think what's happened in the last decade is that it has become particularly important to China, essentially for the coal. But I suppose my big question mark is how long will that continue, given the Chinese themselves have indicated that they intend to become more green. So I suppose my biggest thing is not so much that sanctions are going to bring North Korea to its knees, though clearly they've constrained the economic growth. It's that their economic model vis-a-vis China suddenly becomes redundant. In much the same way as, for example, the oil price has collapsed, has impacted, Russia and Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. I suppose the issue would be, is that more likely to be the catalyst? Because once the coal runs out, once the ability to export coal to generate foreign currency earnings is reduced, then what does North Korea produce for the rest of the world? Insufficient quantities and sufficient revenues to pay its way in the world. I think that's probably going to be the biggest issue for them. What I think was interesting was that, for example, the Chinese essentially had taken virtually the whole of their output that they wanted from North Korea in the first few months, so they could then say, well, we've done the sanctions. They've got $1 billion in the country. I think they certainly want to exploit that investment for a fair bit longer. But clearly they're wanting to appear to be constructive, to to the United States without fueling a problem between those two. Russia, I think, is quite heavily reliant on North Korean labour in the Siberian, because otherwise its alternative is it has to rely on the Chinese, which it has some concerns about. Overall, I think, you know, there isn't those level of threats right now. I think the coal thing is more of a mid-term problem. And I think, actually, I think that the reality for Russia and China is not so much that it's of any economic importance, is that they want to use it as essentially some sort of counterweight to the Americans. Because if the Americans were to take, or South Koreans were to take over that north, you then bring the US capabilities a lot closer to the Chinese border, which is something that the Chinese have clearly indicated they'll never accept.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.